For tens of thousands of years, this land was wilderness. Huge glaciers had shaped the valleys, then melted. Trails were all animal trails, but the land looked much as it looks today. Far to the north, the Bering Strait, 56 miles of sea, separates North America from Asia. Long ago, these continents were joined by an icy plain or land bridge that has since disappeared. Across this narrow point, more than 20,000 years ago, came man. The first man to set foot on this land was the hunter, who followed wandering animals that provided his food and clothing. Many of the animals he hunted are now extinct. American camels, ground sloths, mastodons, mammoths, and giant bison. With spear in hand, he moved on foot with the game and slowly spread over all of North and South America. In different places, over thousands of years, he developed distinct traditions and cultures, better tools and weapons. To hunt, early man made weapons of stone, carefully chipped and flaked into spear points. First, roughly shaped with a stone, the points were finished with animal bone or antler and attached to wooden shafts. Spear points of the Folsom man differed slightly from those of the earlier Clovis man. Prehistoric man followed the game, which was life. In addition to the meat of the kill, early man gathered and ate berries, nuts, and roots. After thousands of years, prehistoric man no longer wandered as widely as he had. He exchanged objects and ideas with other peoples. From the south, he learned of corn to plant and harvest. Cultivating crops allowed him to live a less nomadic life. Along the rivers of the plains, men such as the woodland people began to settle in villages. There they made simple but effective tools from bone and stone. Containers of plain gray-black pottery were used. In the northwest corner of Colorado, the Fremont people who lived in caves also learned to raise corn. They wore sandals and clothing made of fur and woven yucca fiber. With feathers and animal skins, they fashioned colorful headdresses and may have worn ceremonial masks. Designs and pictures were pecked or drawn on stone. Further south and to the west of the towering San Juan Mountains, continents lived a people today's Navajos called Anasazi, the Ancient Ones. Over hundreds of years, from about the time of Christ to 1300 AD, these people developed a complex and advanced culture. Because they were especially skilled at weaving fine baskets, the earliest of these people are known as basket makers. Short and dark-haired, they probably didn't look very different from today's Indians. With yucca, the basket makers wove ropes and wild game snares. Hunters used the atlatl to give more power and distance to the throw. The spear, used for centuries, was much the same. But the atlatl acted as an extension of the hunter's arm, providing added force and distance. Knives of sharpened bone and stone were used. The basket makers grew beans and squash, but corn was the staple crop. It was stored in shallow holes in the ground until it was ready to be shelled. After shelling, the corn was ground on stones called metates, with hand stones called manos. First cracked with a rough stone, kernels were then ground with finer stones until cornmeal was obtained. After water was added, it could be made into patties to be cooked on a flat stone over the fire. Meat was similarly cooked. Some food was cooked by dropping hot stones into watertight baskets. Basket makers often lived together in villages of pit houses partially dug into the ground, with roofs of wood and mud masonry. They wore fur robes, blankets of woven yucca fiber covered with turkey feathers or rabbit fur, and yucca sandals. They made simple jewelry of bone, seeds, shells, animal and bird claws, turquoise and polished stones to trade and to wear. By 700 AD, the later period of the Anasazi culture, known as the Pueblo, had evolved. These people reached their highest level of development during the Great or Classic Pueblo period, about 1050 to 1300 AD. The Pueblo looked different from the basket maker, perhaps because other groups had moved into the area, or because infants were tightly strapped to cradle boards, which flattened their heads. They lived in small villages on the mesa tops and in stone houses built into the cliff faces. There were over 500 dwellings in the Mesa Verde area alone, from one-room houses to large communal structures, as many as 3 or 4 stories high, and containing more than 200 rooms. One large building was the home of some 400 people, farmers and their families. Most cliff houses could be reached only by steps in the canyon walls or by wooden ladders. By building their homes in the cliffs, they could defend themselves against their enemies and, thus protected, develop their culture relatively undisturbed. Walls of the houses were made of sandstone shaped into blocks and laid with a clay mortar. They were covered with adobe plaster, sometimes colored or decorated with designs. Rooms were small, with either T-shape or rectangular doorways. Skins, baskets, and pottery were usually the only furnishings. Ladles, bowls, and pots were made by women coiling ropes of clay into discs. Then building up the sides. Impurities had been removed, and the clay tempered with sand. After the container was fashioned, sides were smoothed, and later an additional thin coating of clay applied. It was allowed to dry, then fired and usually decorated with distinctive black geometric designs, using paint from native plants and minerals. Central to the village were the kivas, underground rooms which were usually round. Here men gathered to work, to perform ceremonial rites, or simply to enjoy fellowship. Near the fireplace was dug the sipapu, a small hole which to the Pueblo people symbolized the entryway of the spirits who lived below. They often called upon these spirits to bring about abundant rainfall, plentiful crops, and good hunting. For hunting, the atlatl was still used, although the newer bow and arrow made the kill easier. Turkeys and dogs ran freely around the villages. Outside in the courtyard, most of the household activities, weaving, cooking, and milling took place. The Pueblo people gathered berries, roots, and nuts, but they were primarily farmers. They raised their main crop, corn and beans and squash, on the mesa tops and in the narrow river valleys. Conserving water was essential in this semi-arid region. The Pueblo people developed an elaborate system of ditches to collect the scanty rainfall and to divert it to reservoirs. The water was then channeled to the fields and to the villages for household use. But the rains did not always come. Between 1276 and 1299, the cliff dwellers waited helplessly for the life-giving moisture. But the drought persisted. Crops withered. Raids from neighboring tribes and perhaps disease also contributed to their plight. Gradually, they turned their backs on their homes, abandoned them, and moved south. For hundreds of years, the ruins stood in silence. a silence only recently broken by the sounds of modern men carefully brushing away the dust of centuries. Archaeologists reconstructing the past of a people for whom there are no written records. Who were they? How did they live? Where did they come from? Why did they go? Their story must be found in the things they left behind. A tool, a basket, a piece of pottery. Each is a clue, a part of the puzzle of their past. The earliest hunters, Clovis and Folsom Man. The woodland people of the plains. The Fremont men of the Northwest. The basket makers. The Pueblo people. Although they left pictures, these men could not write and were not written about. And for this reason, we call them prehistoric. Some descendants of the early Colorado people continued to live the simple life of their ancestors. Until in the 16th century, when moving northward out of Mexico, the Spanish conquistadores encountered them and recorded what they saw.
With his people a long, long time. Before he died, he talked to his people and spoke of some things that would come to them, things they did not understand. He said that our great-grandfather had put people on this earth, all kinds of people. He made us. But he also made others that we would meet someday. Who were white, who would have hair on their faces, who would wear clothes different from ours. They would be our people who would keep pushing forward and would try to teach us their ways of living and would keep at what they tried to do. There would be so many of these people that we would not be able to stand before them. Great mystery, wise one above, I am poor and in need. The sky, the earth you created, take pity on us. Earth Mother, give us food of all kinds that we will eat together. Wise one, where the sun rises, make the ground firm that we may walk and live. Where the cold winds come from, make the water flow that we may drink. where the sun goes down, make the plants grow that we may heal ourselves. Where the cold winds go, make the buffalo come that we may eat. Wise one above, pity us, that the tribe may live. I am sending my heart back over the years to the days of my forefathers. Those old ones could not write. They kept everything in their heads and told it to their children, so that my people would not forget. These are stories of my people, the Ute who have lived in the mountains even in their earliest days, and the Indians of the plains, Cheyenne, Arapaho and Pawnee, Comanche, Kiowa, and Sioux. Before coming to the plains, the old ones lived among the woodlands and lakes toward the sunrise. Sometimes they fought with enemies of a different tongue, and when their enemies grew too strong, they packed all their belongings and slowly moved toward the sunset. One day, they stood at the edge of the great plains. The land was big, like the sky that everywhere reached down to touch it. The wind blew free, and no shadow broke the sunlight. They looked far out into endless, ever-moving brown herds of buffalo. When the Indians moved on to the plains to live with the buffalo, they forgot many of their old ways, gave up the settled life, for on the open land there was little to eat except what was hunted, and little shelter except what was carried. When horses, first brought to America by the Spanish, reached the Plains Indians, their lives changed greatly. Food was more plentiful, villages grew larger, teepees bigger, the Plains people freer. They became great travelers, seeking even the hills in the distant blue vision. Tribe fighting tribe, a way of life for the Indian. In battle, he could win for himself the feathers of the eagle. Great honor went to the brave who touched his enemy and left him alive. When the snow flew, after the north winds brought the frost, there was not always enough to eat. But when the sun was warm and the days were long, there was more food for the villages in the valleys of the river. From youth, boys were urged to become true warriors, to seek the dangers of the fight and hunt, to love glory and praise, to scorn cowardice, to fear disgrace. Young girls learned to do the tiring work with pride. Braves hunted the game. Squaws skinned and cleaned it, dried the meat and dressed the hides. Women made the lodges and put them up. These were homes for families, sometimes relatives, even the orphaned, aged, or crippled, who lived on the generosity of the camp. From ancient days, the Indian saw and heard many wonders of nature that inspired his thoughts, words, and way of life. He admired the swiftness of the antelope, strength of the buffalo, freedom of the eagle. He called himself by their names: White Eagle, sitting bull. White antelope. He marked his time by the sun, his age by the seasons, his direction by the wind, his distance by a day's journey. His was a world of mystery and belief. He believed all of nature was guided by mystic powers. To them he prayed for success in the hunt, glory in battle. The things of his world were given to him by the Creator of all, Great One of power and knowledge.
They were called Spider, these men of light skin, when the Indians first came upon them, for they were clever like the spider that seemed to walk on air. They were wise and had instruments that were strange to the Indian. These spider men moved on to the plains, explored the land, and called it theirs. Men like Zebulon Pike, who tried to convince the Indian of the power of the white, whose weapons were of iron and brass, not wood and stone. This was a wild new land for the white, a challenge to be explored and mapped. For scientists on the Stephen Long expedition of 1820, it was a fascinating world of plants, animals, birds, and insects never seen before. But more often, the plains were hot, dull, and wide. The expedition returned to call it the Great American Desert. Because of this, few settlers came to live among the Indians for years. The few who came were trappers and traders from Mexico, Canada, and the States. They came to trade with the Indian for beaver pelts and buffalo skins that could be made into hats, coats, and robes. They built mud-walled forts, Vasquez, St. Vrain, and Lupton on the South Platte, Davy Crockett on the Green, and Bent's on the Arkansas. Here they brought goods from all over the world.
Traders were welcome in the village. They brought goods the Indian could not make from the buffalo. Flint and steel to make fire, kettles to cook food in, iron to make arrow points. Things that were the color of the trees and sky. Axe heads from England, cloth from Europe. Green River knives. Beads from Venice. Sugar from the West Indies. Whiskey from Taos. Shells from Monterey. The Indians saw that these were better than many things handed down from the days of old. Indian ways began to change. Still, they knew well the land of their heritage, the land that gave them life. And the traders learned from them, eating their food, wearing their clothes, speaking their language. Later, trappers and traders became government agents and could understand the strange customs of the Indians because they were not unknown to them.
By the mid-1800s, settlers were traveling the Oregon and Santa Fe trails across the plains on their way to California, Utah, and Oregon. Out on the plains, they stopped only to rest. But the hills and streams and grass were the home of the Indian, and the wagons were driving the buffalo away. Indian agents were sent out to live among the Indians and to make treaties with them. Agreements in which the United States government promised food and presents if the Indians would not attack the wagons. Age-old enemy tribes were asked to live away from each other, to keep them from fighting among themselves.
All of this was written down, and to show that the Indians agreed to it, chiefs put their marks on the papers. Almost with every winter came another agreement. Soon these treaties said that the Indians should not cross certain rivers or hilltops. That was strange. From ancient days, the land was free. But some chiefs agreed to the treaties and led their people on to reservations. But some did not. They said, how do the buffalo know about such agreements? And the Indian lives where the buffalo lives.
To keep peace, soldiers were sent west into Colorado where they later built forts. Garland and Lewis near mountain settlements, Lyon and Sedgwick along the plains trails. They came to prevent war and to punish hostile Indians who marauded the land they had agreed to relinquish. Until the Pikes Peak gold rush of '59, few white men had settled the high plains and mountains. Gold brought seekers into the territory by the thousands, especially into the mountain land of the Ute. The Indians stole what they could, for such was admired among their people, but not the whites. So we often traded with them.
Many others came with the gold diggers and brought their sheep and cattle to eat the same grass as the buffalo. And still more came to plow the ground, to plant their food.
Got me a farm now, if you could call it that. Land's sure different here, hard and dry. No wonder the natives didn't farm much. Only thing is, they worry me some. They go out hunting their buffalo and they end up on the warpath. Hardly anyone left here to fight. Most everyone went back to volunteer for the war. Being here all by myself sometimes,
They spoke, but they did not hear. Their words were of a different tongue. Their ways of life were of opposite sides of the world. At Camp Weld in 1864, they talked of fighting and blame, but not of the things that made them distrust one another.
Indian wishes to live the way of his father, and his father before him. White man wants him to live by written laws.
The Indian agreed to live on reservations.
Grass is poor. Buffalo do not run there.
The Indian should raise cattle and cultivate the soil.
Indian wishes to hunt wild meat for food, shelter, tools.
Each Indian should have his own land.
Land is free like air and water.
The Indian promises to be peaceful for presents from the whites. Still, they war and steal.
Sometimes presents do not come. Indian starves, then takes. Many hunting grounds gone. Many Indian ways gone. Reservation is not Indian way. That never was Indian way.
When wronged by a white, the Indian brings down his vengeance on any white.
When wronged by Indian, white man brings down vengeance on any Indian.
Settlers will be protected. Peaceful Indians should gather around army posts.
On November 29, 1864, Colonel John M. Shivington led the Colorado Cavalry to the banks of Sand Creek.
Hearts wail. Minds speak thoughts of vengeance. What do we have to live for? The white man has taken our country, killed our game, was not satisfied with that, but killed our wives and children. Now, no peace. We have raised the battle axe until death.
The Overland, Santa Fe, Smoky Hill, these trails were too long, the plains too big, troops too few.
Captain, the first sentry fired a shot.
Who would be next? Which stage? Whose ranch? Which wagon train? Where? When? Across the plains, there was no peace.
The Iron Horse was feared and hated. It brought hunters who killed buffalo only for hides, leaving the Indians food to rot in the fields, till the wind smelled of death, till bones covered the plains.
Sure is hot today. So is.
2 ways of living and 2 kinds of men. They would not live together in peace and could not be kept apart. There was more fighting, more treaties, more presence until by 1867, the Comanche, Pawnee, and Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa, and Sioux agreed to live on reservations outside the Colorado Territory. But hostiles continued to leave their reservations to maraud the plains. Twice they fought on their old Colorado hunting grounds. Beecher Island, September 1868. Summit Springs, July 1869. It was their last stand. Never again was the battle axe raised on the Colorado plains. For a decade more, the Ute Indians lived peacefully in the mountains hunting their reserves. But their hunting grounds were growing smaller as new gold and silver deposits were found. Their government agent, Nathan Meeker, kept trying to make them farmers, until finally some of the Utes massacred the agent and 11 other men.
General Adams.
Hello, Mrs. Meeker.
His wife later spoke of how the agent had wanted to raise the Utes out of their misery by teaching them the wonders of modern society. He was determined to lead them to wealth and happiness, by love if possible, by force if necessary. He failed, for the Meeker massacre provoked a public demand that the Utes be removed from the Colorado mountains.
The plow, the school, the barbed wire fence, these were for the white men, not for the Indian. He wished to live as his father, and as his grandfather, and as his father before him. He wanted to be swift like the antelope, crafty like the wolf, free like the eagle that soared above the plains. But these are only stories now. For those days, like the mighty buffalo, are gone forever.